I think there'd be businesses that are getting to that point in their journey where maybe exit is on the table or on the cards, getting a ton of PR coverage leading into those conversations with prospective buyers would completely change the way they perceive the business.
The problem is that a lot of investors get hundreds of pitches every single day, and they're like, why should I look at your pitch? I just got like 100 pitch decks sent to me. And when you're featured in the media, it literally puts you in the top 1%, not only with investors, but also customers and even potential employees.
What about frequency? What's kind of the average that you would recommend to a business that wants to go down this route for pursuing PR?
The ideal, of course, with any type of marketing is to do it consistently, but it's still better to do like a little bit of PR and have something coming up rather than nothing at all.
Aidan, welcome to the podcast. Can you share a little bit about your journey and background in the PR world?
I initially started out into the whole marketing space and with the MIT Enterprise Forum, Cambridge. Around a couple of years later, I branched off, started my own marketing company. Initially speaking in like the lead generation space, so I came from it from the point of view of like direct advertising, putting in $10 to get back 50. But when the whole COVID-19 thing happened, I made the transition to PR just because I noticed at that point in time, the branding was more important than anything because everyone was like had all these trust objections and everything like that. And they're like, why should I trust you? Like my money is like, I'm scared the world's going to end and all these things. And so that's how I, by accident, almost got into like the PR/branding space.
Fascinating, because I have conversations with business owners and the PR gets thrown out there a lot. And I don't think a lot of them understand the strategy, how it works. What do you feel like some of the biggest challenges when you're talking to clients and business owners when it comes to getting media attention?
I would say the biggest objections are probably when it comes to getting attention. It's like pretty easy to get attention, quite frankly, if you're reaching out to journalists, which on a local basis. On a national basis, it's pretty much impossible if you don't have any news coverage.
And do they have any challenges that keep recurring? Like you speak to business owners and they're looking at PR when they're coming from a challenge perspective. What's sort of the general thing that you see with businesses that struggle with it?
Oh, so I would say the number one thing, which I see people who don't have PR is a lot of trust objections. So they're like, why should I trust you? Send me over a referral. Can I listen to some testimonials? All those types of objections, which could basically disappear when you have a lot of PR coverage around yourself. Like I would almost find it ridiculous if someone who's considered like a quote unquote thought leader, like Gary Vaynerchuk or whatever's on the call, people like send me over a referral or something like that. I don't think I could ever see that happening. It's just because he's already established like that brand for himself. When you Google him, you see all these news outlets coming up. And that's the ultimate goal of like an entrepreneur. People don't think of themselves as a brand. People see corporate things as a brand, like Coca-Cola, Google, etc. But what a lot of people don't realize is the whole personal side of things, which could basically eliminate like a lot of the trust objections. Everyone's a brand, whether they know it or not.
I agree with that. And do you have any examples of maybe a client that you worked with and what a media placement did to actually change their brand and their brand perception?
Yeah, so like one of our clients, which we just worked with pretty recently, we got them onto approximately 40 podcasts. And we also got them featured in a bunch of news articles like USA Today. And basically, as a result of that, they were able to get an offer to sell their business. And they were also able to generate a ton of customers during that time. But that was able to get that offer because that was one of their long-term goals, to sell their business. And the investors saw that. They saw the media coverage. They're like, wow, this business looks like amazing. We want to buy it.
That's really epic, because I think there'd be businesses that are getting to that point in their journey where maybe exit is on the table or on the cards, and what can they do to amplify their value, their positioning, and make it more attractive to a buyer. Getting a ton of PR coverage leading into those conversations with prospective buyers would completely change the way they perceive the business. And I guess that would be a really good reason to explore PR.
Exactly. And another potential reason is we work with like a lot of tech companies, right? And one of the key problems of the tech companies, you got to spend a ridiculous amount of money every single stage, and you got to get investors. But the problem is that a lot of investors get hundreds of pitches every single day, and they're like, why should I look at your pitch? I just got like 100 pitch decks sent to me. And when you're featured in the media, I've talked to like hundreds of investors about this. It literally puts you in the top 1% because 99% don't do anything with their brand. They're just sending out the same blanket pitch deck, aren't really putting that type of effort in. they sent out that exact same thing to hundreds of other investors. Not exactly the most effective way. So when you have that media coverage, it just makes you different, increases likelihoods of conversations, not only with investors, but also customers and even potential employees. If you're potentially looking to work for a company and you see the company's been featured in Forbes, USA Today, and a ton of major news outlets, you probably want to work with that company versus the one which doesn't have that.
Really good point. The overlooked part of any form of marketing, in my opinion, is the attracting the talent, because you get the best people on board, it increases output, it makes the business so much better. And so many businesses struggle with recruiting, so they forget the role that exposure, content, all those moving parts play to make that company a destination employer in the workspace. Now, I know you're famous, I think you've coined it, for local dominance through media. Do you want to explain what local dominance is and some of the strategies you use to create local dominance?
Yeah, local dominance is just being perceived as like the local industry leader in your space. And the way you go about doing that is by basically having like a ton of news coverage coming up when people search you up online. So having features like Yahoo Finance, Forbes, USA Today, tons of major news outlets, because it automatically puts you in that top 1%. And you'll notice in pretty much every single industry, it's a pretty interesting thing, whether it's the marketing industry, whether it's, you're a chiropractor, a plastic surgeon, no matter what you're going into, the leaders consistently have news coverage. They all have like the as seen on. And then the people who don't, they're kind of like maybe struggling or not quite up there. So there's just a massive difference. And the customers see it. The funny thing is the people who don't understand it are usually the ones who basically making a lot less money.
I agree with that. And on the local level, there's international scale, there's national scale, then localized scale. What's the difference with a PR strategy when you're focusing on like a fixed distribution area versus, say, an international audience? How do you approach that?
Yeah, so I usually first start off on the local level. It's like get you connected with some like local news outlets, get you that local news coverage, kind of get that going, get your story out there. And then long term, I always kind of say like, the long term goal of a lot of businesses is to go national, actually. What some of our clients have done is they look to do franchising, they look to start to get more locations, etc. And at that point in time, it's good to get into some national level news coverage, just like Forbes and USA Today. But if your goal is simply just to be like a local business, which is cool, I would probably say local news coverage, podcasts, TV interviews is probably like the best way.
And how do you approach that? Are you using like a Rolodex of connections, or do you have some sort of outreach strategy? How do you as an agency open those doors for the business owners and entrepreneurs?
It's just a lot of years of expertise, quite frankly, and a bit of luck. I feel like there's always a little bit of luck in business. Like people say there isn't, but for me, at the very least, it's definitely been pretty lucky in some regards. Like I meet a guy who happens to know a guy, who happens to know a guy, who happens to know a guy. And it just kind of, over the years, I've just gotten pretty fortunate in terms of I'm very connected on like a local level along with the national level. Yes, we do pitching as well, but we're actually able to guarantee media coverage, which is what most companies cannot do, because we have those Rolodex of contacts where I could just give a ring and be like, hey, you want to feature this guy? I think he'd be like a great fit.
Amazing. And is there a best time to use PR, or are there some examples with clients that they commonly approach you to get a specific outcome?
I would say that's kind of like a misconception. There's no best time for PR because PR is your brand. It's something which is going to be with you forever. So I would actually say the best time is now, because the longer you don't have a brand, the more you're having those issues which typically come with someone who doesn't have PR. So that would be like trust objections, more difficult to get investors, more difficult to hire like really good talent, those types of things. So the sooner you eliminate that entire thing, the better.
What about frequency? If you're engaging a PR strategy in your business, is it something that you continually do, or is it something that you do once off or twice a year? What's kind of the average that you would recommend to a business that wants to go down this route for pursuing PR?
I would say it depends kind of case by case. I mean, obviously, like a business which is just starting out a few years in, it's not realistic for them to spend every single month on PR. However, if you've been in it longer, the ideal, of course, with any type of marketing is to do it consistently, because then your audience sees like, oh, wow, they're consistently getting featured in the media. That's like a super ideal scenario. But it's still better to do like a little bit of PR and have something coming up rather than nothing at all.
On that note, what's the key to writing, say, a viral story that might get picked up by Fox, NBC, Forbes, those well-known media outlets?
Like, for example, one of our clients which we worked with, he was like a financial advisor, and he got featured to Yahoo Finance. It's actually pretty rare for like a lot of financial advisors to get featured into these different like Yahoo Finance and stuff like that. And I got reached out to by like Dr. Phil. So there's always like those kind of like crazy probabilities. He's like, wow, this guy seems amazing. And that kind of almost shows like the power of getting your story out there. Because if you aren't featured in any news outlets, the rest of the world doesn't even know you exist in terms of like, you're not even on their radar whatsoever. So some people think that the press will just randomly reach out to them someday, but they don't even know you exist. You're not even on the map.
And how hard is it for a story to get picked up? And I'm talking in the context of you're working with a client. The average business owner off the street is really going to struggle to get a story picked up. How consistently is a story that you put together getting the coverage?
I would say that we have like ways to, for example, get consistently into Forbes or consistently get into major TV outlets and stuff like that. I would say viral campaigns are pretty rare. I put them like 1 out of every 200. But I would say the goal of PR is not virality necessarily for a local business. While that can be helpful, the goal is just to be like, be able to charge higher prices, be able to be seen as an authority, because people will pay more money if they perceive something to be a better quality service. It's not always like the cheapest possible thing. However, if you don't have a brand, then you're basically just competing with like, for example, in a product-based business, you're competing with like Amazon, who has like, they're going to go crazy to keep the price low as possible. So rather than trying to fight in that regard, it's much better have like a brand, because then you're distinguishing yourself from like, the Amazons of the world, which are going to try to get the lowest possible margin and try to drive you out of business.
We talk about that a fair bit on the podcast. We call it the invisible hand. It's what people find about your business when they're in discovery or research mode, and what they don't find can also impact whether they trust you, want to move forward or not. So it plays a fundamental role. And we also talk about how, especially for a local business, sometimes it's more about the quality of the attention and the eyeballs as much as the width is. Is there any way that you focus on getting targeted distribution that's in line with that business's audience? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I specifically focus on like local, plus like, for example, the case of a real estate agent getting into like the Pinnacle Times, getting it featured in Min. These are all like local news outlets specific to those types of industries, and obviously specific to the country. So like in like Australia, for example, there's like Forbes Australia, there's International Business Times Australia. So obviously getting specific to like the location is very effective and highly recommended. Yeah.
So what are some of the different ways that you sort of measure the impact of media placements and PR for clients when you're working with them?
There's a couple of different ways. So, the first thing also is when you're getting featured in the media, some people see that as the finish, like, oh, I got featured, that's it. But that's actually not the finish. You want to be able to take that content, share it across social media, send it out to your existing email list, basically leverage it everywhere. Like we've even had clients who print out their article and put it up on like their local shop, and when customers are coming by and they're like, oh wow, you're featured, I want to go with you, etc. So I would say that's like the ultimate impact, so like the level of engagement which you get from your existing email list with your social media across all those different impacts. But it's also kind of like a long-term game, and some of it is a little bit intangible, meaning customers might be signing up with you because you've got a brand. They might not tell you, hey, I'm signing up with you because I trust you because you've got a brand. They'll just sign up. So some of it's a little bit intangible, but there's definitely like a noticeable difference long term. I typically see like over 12 months, you'll definitely notice like an increase in revenue, increase in close ratio. Those are the types of things we notice.
And what you're saying is when you get media coverage or you get PR, you've got an asset. So take that asset and repurpose that asset so you can expand the lifetime value that you get from that media pickup.
And beyond that, another thing which some of our clients do is they take that piece of news coverage, that article, and they put it onto Facebook, because on Facebook ads, you can get a lot of reach, and they specifically target their ideal target audience with that as like a brand creative, or they send them to a landing page which has that particular thing, the fact they were featured, and that has a much higher conversion rate than like typical ads. We've seen 2 to 3x increase in conversion just because of that news feature. So that's like a direct use case of it where someone could derive an ROI directly.
So what would be your number one tip for anyone listening to the podcast that owns a business that wanted to go down the PR path? What would you say to them? Where do you start? What's the number one thing you'd suggest?
I would say the first thing I'd start out with was local news. Reach out to your local news outlets. There's another platform. Some people know it, some people don't. It's called Help a Reporter Out. It's a pretty good way to kind of get started. Another one's Quoted. It's with QWOTED.com. It's a really good way. Basically, there's a lot of journalists who have queries. They're looking to kind of get a story out there, but they need a subject matter expert to answer those questions. And then beyond that, obviously optimizing your social media and your website. It's like pretty crazy how many people don't have like a secure website or a well-designed website or like a well-designed Instagram with like them as like the actual photo and like, good amount of photos talking about what they do. So optimizing all of those things. And then once you're kind of ready, then, maybe thinking about paid options.
When someone comes to go down that route with you, what's the process like? How do you sit down with a business owner or an entrepreneur and I guess create a game plan? How does that process work on your side?
It's really simple. I mean, we basically just send them like an intake form to gather all their goals, like some types of story angles. We brainstorm with them a bit in terms of like potential angles which the customers would find interesting, or investors, depending on their overall goals. And then from there, we proceed to get them published. We have extremely fast publishing times, typically within like 14 to 30 days. We just get our clients published in like a lot of news articles. And then after that, we just, show them how to leverage it in terms of everything else.
Incredible. So anyone that's listening that is curious and is liking the potential that PR could have for them, their business, and they wanted to have that conversation with you, how do they get in touch? What's the next step?
They can reach out to me over Instagram at the Aidan Sowa, or the website, it's velvetvoicepr.com.
We'll put those links in the show notes below. So for anyone that wants to go down this route and wants to take this conversation further, reach out to Aidan. Clearly doing incredible work and helping a lot of people blow up with this PR strategy. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast, Aidan. This has been a great conversation and one that I've always wanted to have with someone that specializes in PR.
Appreciate you having me on.